Thanks, Joel. Yes, I had to share this study because I was actually surprised at the results. So this study was published in Science Advances in 2018. And if you recall, this was just after Vermont's law was passed and implemented, where their state was requiring mandatory labeling of foods made through genetic engineering, right? Or foods containing genetically modified ingredients. So there was a huge uproar amongst consumers about genetically engineered foods and were they safe to eat, and we want them to be labeled, right? And if you remember in 2016, in that legislative session, there were 70 bills that were introduced in 25 different states that were addressing this labeling issue of should we actually label these genetically engineered foods? Vermont was the only state that actually passed it. They passed it in 2014. This mandatory labeling of GMOs was implemented in 2016. And then, of course, it was later superseded, right, when Obama signed that federal legislation into law in later July of 2016. But here's the thing. There is a study conducted to see how did the consumer's attitude towards genetically engineered foods change before the mandated label and after the mandated label, okay? And what this study actually found was that in Vermont, when the mandatory labeling happened, it actually led to a decrease in their opposition to genetically engineered foods. To be specific, it was a 19% decrease in opposition toward genetically engineered foods. So for me, I'm thinking, well, gosh, that's the opposite of what I would think, right? Like now it's labeled. Now you see how many foods actually have genetically engineered ingredients in it. And that awareness, shouldn't that bring, a feeling of, oh, I don't want to eat those foods?
Well, so Cena, so just to make sure I'm following you here on the argument, this decrease in opposition, this 19% decrease in opposition, how did they measure that decrease in opposition? In sales or what letters to the editor? Or, how was that opposition? How was that decrease measured?
That's a great point. So this study, the reason I bring it up is because there's been hypothetical models for years about, because the debate has been so strong, right? Because predominantly the people who are for GMOs, they didn't want the stuff labeled because they were presuming it would be off-putting to the consumer and they would lose sales, right? And then you got us who want to know what we're eating. We want the transparency. We want it labeled. So there's been a huge debate, and there's been all these theoretical models put forward supporting both sides, okay? This was the first study that actually examined the real-world impact of the consumer attitude towards these GMO foods, okay? The first study to examine the real-world impact, and this is how they did it. They conducted phone surveys. They conducted them in Vermont and the rest of the United States. And the phone surveys were done 5 times, 3 time periods before the mandatory labeling took effect, and then 2 time periods after the mandatory labeling took effect. So they started in 2014 and they ended in 2017. Okay. And they also did this to correct for different demographics. They also used 5 different models too. Once they got the data, they tried 5 different models. And the effect remained stable over all 5 of these models. And what they saw was that based on these real world experiences, they say the study provides evidence that just a simple disclosure, and by simple disclosure, and this is really important, what they mean by that is on the label, it will say either produced using genetic engineering or partially produced using genetic engineering. So this is what's called a simple disclosure, and that's what Vermont voted to have on their food, was a clear, simple disclosure, okay? So this study says This study provides evidence that a simple disclosure is not likely to signal the consumer that genetically engineered foods are more risky, unsafe, or otherwise harmful than before label exposure, and in fact, could do the opposite. So, what they said was this study could not identify why the change happened. So, they seem pretty surprised too that all of a sudden there's in Vermont, right? And they even point that out in Vermont, potentially the most educated state on genetically modified organisms, the one who passed the law. Once it was labeled, there's less opposition. And they're like, why is this happening? And the study says, we can identify why this change occurred, but the findings are consistent with previous research suggesting that labels give consumers a sense of control, which has been shown to be related to risk perception. Whether labels improve a sense of control, improve trust, or operate by some other psychological mechanism is a question that we leave to future research. Here we showed that in the real world exposure to genetically engineered disclosure, attitude toward genetically engineered foods improved.